Thank you for having me and giving this chance for talking about my research. I am a research fellow at the University College London in the UNESCO Chair in Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Engineering. I've been working on the multi-hazard resilience of school systems. By school systems, I mean a network of schools in a region that is connected by a road network, which can be impacted by hazards such as floods and earthquakes. In particular, in the UNESCO chair, we look at the hazard vulnerability of school infrastructure as compared to other infrastructure. So why we do this in terms of the schools particularly is that we have had a lot of instances in the past where schools are either either physically damaged or functionally damaged because of either flood events or earthquake events. And this can be occurring in overlapping time and space windows. So if you see around the world, there are several locations where both these hazards are severe and one can occur while the other is also an existing event. But in this particular study, we're looking at long-term effects of floods on schools and then followed by earthquake events and how that influences the response capacity of these buildings. So in order to consider these kind of multiple hazards and their influence on structures, we understand that we need a system level assessment tool that can integrate the uncertainties also in terms of the hazard modeling and the exposure modeling. So this is where we try to bring the system approach into this problem, where we have the infrastructure of schools, as you can see in the very top left, where you have a number of schools in a region. So in order to have a system level approach, first we are actually going to disintegrate into components, that is by classification systems where we identify representative buildings in the sample and then have a detailed building level physical fragility assessment. I understand that the audience is from a very varied range of disciplines, and this is a very purely structural or civil engineering perspective. And then we bring back the component level fragility functions to build the system level Bayesian networks and assess the level of system in terms of the disruption that is caused to the education delivery in schools. So what are the factors that come into play in this particular problem? In terms of external factors, we have the hazards, which can be characterized in terms of intensity measures and their exceedance probabilities. We can probably consider the interaction between hazards, like I previously mentioned. And also there is the other factor of the communities that is served by the schools. So it's not just the physical damage or inaccessibility due to, say, a flood event that dictates the level of performance of a school infrastructure after a hazard event. It could also be the social vulnerability levels of the community. So this is totally external to the built infrastructure. When it comes to the individual school compounds, we have physical infrastructure. They can be of different typologies, some more vulnerable than the others, for which we can characterize these particulars through the physical fragility. And then again, the social infrastructure that is relevant to that particular school in terms of the population size of the students and age distribution. Thirdly, the functionality aspect. Even when the school is physically fine, it may not be able to function if it's not accessible. And when we then take into the infrastructure system level, we have the aspects of connectivity between schools, whether they are accessible from one school to another, how is their size and capacity, whether they have capacity to accommodate more students if there need be, what are their relative damageability, and whether in several cases schools are used as shelters after disaster events. So that can also influence the ability of a school to deliver education. So we will consider all of these factors into developing a Bayesian network for the assessment of disruption to school systems from flood and seismic hazards. And through these factors, we would be incorporating the physical, functional, and social aspects of education delivery. Coming to the Bayesian network that is developed for this flowchart gives an idea of the structure of the Bayesian network that is going to be implemented. I don't think we need to go into the basics of Bayesian network in this particular conference. So In the first instance, we would characterize the hazards and then the structural performance of the buildings from the combined effects of flood and seismic hazards. And it is often useful to convert the physical damage levels to functionality disruption states, which is a better way of harmonizing the effects of different hazards in terms of the functionality loss rather than the damage states. Then if we want to consider any non-structural mitigation options to reduce the non-structural disruption, that can also be assessed through the network. So here is the network that is applied for a particular case of schools in a city. This is a generic network. The number of schools is not specified here. I will show some examples and results which when this network is applied to a small scale school network in a particular city in India, in Guwahati, India. For this, we used a characterization of flood and seismic hazards from existing literature. As you can see, there is no direct relation that is given between earthquake and floods. But as you will see in the next few slides, that we harmonize the effects in the building performance. It is the first part where you can see in the green box is the physical functionality disruption, which comes from the damage that is inflicted on the building due to the hazard. The second part is the other functionality disruption, which is caused due to the inundation or the flooding of the school site or the flooding of the basin where the school is located. This particular aspect would mean that the people who reside in that basin needs sheltering, and that these two aspects then decide whether this can be used as a shelter or there is a need for shelter. And then this would lead to other functionality losses. The third aspect is the social factors or social vulnerability, which is characterized in terms of the population of each school, the age category and income and education of the community as a whole. So these factors would also influence the shelter function of the school. And from these basic network, we would extract the physical functionality disruption, other functionality disruption, and what is the combined or overall system disruption, with and without the influence of social vulnerability. And as a fourth and final component, I'm also considering the option of non-structural mitigation, where you can move students from a non-functional school to another functional school. So for this particular aspect, we consider the distance between schools and capacity of each school to accommodate its own students and additional students. And also if the schools are connectivity aspect, which also depends on the age distribution of the students. Given that the mobility or the movement of students between schools are possible or feasible, it then reduces the other functionality disruption. We have to note that we are not making any structural interventions. We are not making any schools stronger to bear the load of the hazards. Hence, the physical functionality disruption is not modified here. So this is a first branch, as I mentioned. So in here, we can include as many schools we want. So it's a modular approach where we have n number of schools and m number of buildings in each school. And fragility functions of each school will be used for each building can be used for assessing the physical functionality. This is assessed at the individual school level and then at the overall system level. And this is characterized in three states, whether it's intact, that is not affected, partially functioning, and shut down. So this is also associated with certain durations. So for example, the partially functioning buildings, which can be retrofitted using certain techniques that can take up to 3 months. And in the case, if it's shut down, it can be up to 1 year because we might have to rebuild structures. So how do we assess the physical fragility? This is through a numerical modeling regime or a strategy which is used here. That it's assumed that the building is subjected to years of flooding and it has undergone material degradation in the masonry building. And then we subject the building to certain flood levels, static water heights, followed by ground acceleration. So this would give us a way of assessing the structure performance for the sequential kind of loading. So with what we get from this analysis is the capacity curves, which is the base shear coefficient or base shear capacity of the building versus the lateral deflections. And based on that, we can then apply an N2 method and derive fragility functions. If as a result, we get fragility functions that are bidirectional or bidimensional, because we get fragility functions corresponding to both flood and seismic hazard intensity. The second part, I would just elaborate a little bit on the interdependencies between the nodes, between the variables. So as you can see, each node in the network is defined into multiple, not binary, multiple states, which allows us to have a more level of intervention options and assessment criteria. So in here we have, say, for example, inundation at the basin where the school is located. We can have no inundation or inundation up to certain periods or beyond that. So similarly for the shelter function, this gives us, and how do we define these states is based on the existing knowledge in the field and review of literature. And for each of the states, we then define the conditional probability tables based on the states of its parent nodes. And this is mostly based on what conditions of the previous states could lead to this particular states of the child nodes. Similarly, for the social vulnerability, we have defined these states based on the census information of this location, which gives us the, say, for example, the income and education of the parents, which the range of distribution of the community is available. And it is known that the social vulnerability affects the risk perception and the ability to respond and recover, which is a factor in any design of disaster risk reduction. So we have assessed the social vulnerability with respect to the school community. So it's not very holistic, and it can be further improved. And also we haven't looked at the reverse effect of how the performance of school can be affecting the social vulnerability. This is how we have defined the first three branches. And for the final branch, the mobility of students, as I mentioned, we can then define distances and size of schools, connectivity between schools. And some of these nodes are here defined as binary, and it can then lead to revised or other functionality disruption of the system. And that basic network is then expanded to a generic network for n number of schools in this diagram, and it's modeled on the BNT on MATLAB, and the non-structural mitigation is also implemented. And the results of the analysis is presented here. We get the distribution of the disruption states, the short, medium, and long disruption along both the hazard intensities, like the flood depth and the PGA, peak ground acceleration of the ground in terms of the earthquake hazard. This is for the functionality, which is purely due to the damage of buildings. The other functionality is the second figure, which is due to the accessibility loss or due to shelter function. And the T system gives us the overall system disruption states. The last figure gives us how this gets modified with the influence of social vulnerability. As you can see, this chance of long disruption gets modified, increases with the inclusion of the social vulnerability. Similarly, when we include the mobility aspect, they say when the mobility is made possible, we see that the moderate or medium disruption can be eliminated and most of it can be reduced to short disruption. But as you can see, the overall system disruption is not significantly modified because we haven't implemented any physical interventions. And which is also one other thing that is also interesting in terms of hazard resilience studies is that assessment of the system at a particular given hazard state, say, for example, a maximum considered earthquake. What would be the probability of these states and how we can improve them? So here, how we applied this was in terms of a few case studies, say, for example, the sensitivity analysis of different typology of buildings. In these three figures, the IB1 to IB3, IB1 is the poorest building, while IB3 is better in terms of seismic performance. So we can see how the state of short disruption and the long disruption modifies with respect to the typologies. We see that the one with the poorest performance has a very high chance of long disruption at any given PGA level. Similarly, another aspect of taking out the results was to see the reasoning, like how different parameters influence the disruption state of the system. So in order to see what is causing, what is a more influential factor, so that any intervention can be done for that factor rather than other factors. And a third aspect was to conduct some scenario assessment and decision making. Say, for example, we define certain scenarios which could be a combination of worst conditions. For example, worst typology of buildings versus the poorest kind of social vulnerability. So this can lead to a much higher scenario in terms of long disruption as compared to the nominal case. So this was use of the Bayesian network that was defined before. It was also then used to quantify the uncertainty reduction when we introduce some evidences for inference problem. Using the variable of entropy, we can see how much of each of the evidences can be used to reduce the original uncertainty in the flood states. I think that was all from me. The conclusion is that we are still developing this network further for the assessment of structural and functional resilience of school communities. And it was interesting to see that this can be very well used for integrating qualitative and quantitative information into the same framework, especially with respect to the social vulnerability aspects. And for the time being, we are expanding this network into an influence diagram, where we use this to assess the operational capacity of schools again, but while also including the concept of the road network that is connecting the schools. So in this stage, we are looking at the fragility of local roads and bridges and see if they are operational, and also the regional roads, in order to assess the mobility between schools more rationally. I think that's all from me. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you. And then our studies, the first part of the study is already published in the 2022 paper, if anybody wishes to have a look. Thank you.